Welcome to Smarter Athletes. This presentation is on energy systems and understanding our body's energy systems as athletes. I want to start actually by giving a little bit of a heads up. It's hard to kind of start talking about energy systems without getting into some subtopics of biology and chemistry, and we talk about things like metabolism and cellular respiration, and there are a few bio and chem terms in here that might kind of slip into the presentation, but for the intent and purpose of kind of understanding energy systems as an athlete, we're going to try to keep this as simple as possible, not really get too worried about getting kind of caught up in any other kind of science of it. We do want to understand how our bodies produce energy and how those energy systems work a little differently and perform a little differently, but we don't want to get too worried about the scientific side of it, beyond understanding some pretty simple concepts at least. So what we're talking about today are these energy systems, which refer to the various processes that enable our bodies to do work at different intensities and for different durations. They rely on different sources of fuel, and for the intent and purpose of this presentation, we're going to refer to fuel as substrates in order to perform properly. So the primary energy system at work is entirely dependent, or I should say primarily dependent, on intensity, and then secondarily on the duration of the task. All right, the food that we eat also plays a huge role. It is the fuel for the system that is at work. All right, so of course, specific energy systems can be trained to work in certain ways, and some people have more efficient systems than others, and we'll get to that. But at the end of the day, how our systems perform for us, how well they perform for us under optimal circumstances, has a lot to do with how we fuel them. All right, the reasons why we're talking about it are simple. We want to understand fueling. We want to understand fueling for performance, making sure our bodies are fueled up properly and fueled for recovery for the next performance. We want to understand things like budgeting as well. How much energy do we have to spend and how quickly can we afford to spend it? And then we want to understand planning. Planning for the long term, not just over the course of one training session or competition, but over the course of multiple. So things like meal planning can weigh heavily on which energy systems are we going to be using and for how long. Let's look at a quick agenda for this presentation. We want to start by introducing our energy systems, then move into kind of identifying them as one of two types, whether those systems are aerobic or anaerobic. Then we'll talk about how those systems work, and lastly we'll discuss the adaptations of a training system or an energy system as a result of training. So starting with the systems, we have to understand that there are three. There are three energy systems, starting with the phosphagen system. Now the phosphagen system is the system responsible for very short, maximal, and submaximal bouts of super high intensity work. We're talking about tiny little short bursts of energy, 40-yard dash, a tackle, a vertical jump. Those are all performed using or relying on the phosphagen system as the primary energy system at work. Next up is glycolysis. Now, glycolysis is used for all-out bouts of exercise, but those are bouts that last anywhere between 30 and 120 seconds or 2 minutes in duration. So these would be typically things like a hockey shift or a 200-meter running race or a 400-meter running race, something that an athlete is definitely exerting a maximal all-out effort during, but could last anywhere between that half-minute and 2-minute mark. Lastly, we have the oxidative system. The oxidative system is the slowest moving, lowest intensity system that has the highest range of variability. Now, it's relied upon for stamina and aerobic endurance during any extended bout of exercise. So whether that bout of exercise is an 800-meter or a 1-kilometer long run, or it's something that lasts all day, like an Ironman triathlon, in either case, the oxidative system becomes the primary system at work. The one where we know we're going to be budgeting our energy out over the course of the task, not pushing too hard before burning out and running out of steam. Now, if we think about a transition through the energy system, starting with something like the phosphagen system, we might ask somebody to sprint as fast as they can, as quickly as they can off the line. And if we ask that same person to sprint as fast and as quickly as they could until they could no longer sprint, that sprint would turn into what we'd most identify as a run. And that run, until they couldn't, would turn into what most of us would identify with as a jog, and then finally a walk. And theoretically, that's somebody transitioning through all three of these systems, starting with the highest intensity, highest velocity movement, finishing with an oxidative system effort that really doesn't rely on any of the other energy systems, and it's the only one left to work. So let's talk about the systems as aerobic or anaerobic here, because this is important to understand as well. The first thing we want to discuss is the fact that there's really never one energy system working to perform all of the effort. There's always a primary system at work, but energy systems do change with respect to their contribution to the overall task. So while somebody might start jumping off the line in a sprint formation and the phosphagen system is quick to kind of take over, it pretty quickly becomes a multiple or a joint effort from all three systems. And over the course of that effort, we see changes in contribution from the major or primary system. In the case of the example we just showed, this is the end of that system being entirely an oxidative task as the athlete is only walking. So aerobic systems rely on a steady supply of oxygen to the body, and that's happening in order to maintain an efficient and effective function. So while the supply of oxygen remains constant for the most part, the athlete's maximum volume of oxygen uptake is a trainable feature. That means an athlete who is a long distance runner and trains under those circumstances day in and day out would have a higher level of oxygen uptake to supply a steady state of delivery than somebody who is untrained. Simply put, this means the trained athlete can tolerate an oxidative system work at a higher level of intensity than an untrained athlete. At the end of the day, that means one person may feel like they're sprinting or running quite hard at a non-sustainable effort. Maybe they can only run that fast for 30 seconds or 40 seconds, while another person who's well trained in an oxidative system can hang on to that pace for a very extended period of time. So the oxidative system is entirely aerobic. It provides energy during lower intensity exercise and rest. Now, anaerobic systems are different, of course. The anaerobic term is derived from the Greek word with a literal translation that means to live without air. So in exercise science world, anaerobic refers to processes that occur without oxygen. So even for the most efficiently trained athletes, we're talking about things that are 2 minutes in length or shorter usually. Now the phosphagen system is entirely anaerobic. Tasks that engage this system don't rely on any oxygen at all. So glycolysis is a little bit different, and we're going to get to that in a second. Now, the bodies use the glycolytic pathways in both aerobic and anaerobic capacities. So glycolysis is subcategorized into two different types. There is fast glycolysis, sometimes referred to as the anaerobic type, and then there's slow glycolysis, which is referred to as aerobic. During the fast glycolytic process, our bodies do produce lactic acid, which is commonly mistaken for a cause of sore muscle, and we'll get to that a little later on. It happens at a faster rate, and it happens because our bodies are not taking in enough oxygen to meet the demands. So the alternative, slow glycolysis, does require a sufficient supply of oxygen at the cellular level. At that same output, there is being damage caused to muscle, and that's what causes us to slow down, despite the fact that there is a steady supply of oxygen. Now, what an athlete needs to know about glycolysis is that it is always somewhat anaerobic, meaning that we do start to build up an oxygen debt as long as our bodies are using the glycolytic pathway. That oxygen debt, though, happens at a rate that is determined by whether or not we are using fast or slow glycolysis. Now, earlier when I referred to lactic acid, it's important to recognize that it is not the cause of sore, tired, or dead muscle. All right, so lactic acid is actually something that can be used at the substrate level. It can actually be used as a form of energy. Lactic acid is not necessarily something that makes muscle feel heavy or tired. It is the byproduct of fast glycolysis. All right? Efficiently trained athletes can use the slow glycolytic pathway while their less efficient counterparts are relying on the fast glycolytic pathway. That means, once again, an example of two people running beside one another, one using the slow glycolytic primary energy system and the other using the fast. One is simply put going to run out of steam before the other. When our systems are working for us, we have to understand that at any level of intensity, we are using all three. We're also demanding output from muscle at the cellular level, so the intensity and duration of the task collectively determine the main system at work. In what proportion? So if we refer back to that pie chart I kind of showed you guys earlier, where the different contributions were kind of rotating around, and it started completely blue and then ended completely yellow, that's kind of what we're talking about here. And so let's think of our energy systems as three different gas tanks, just for a minute. And let's think about how they might not necessarily work the same way. So if these are our three fuel tanks here, we have to understand that the oxidative tank is quite big. Now glycolysis is the middle-sized tank, and of course the phosphagen tank is quite small. Starting here, we can understand that the oxidative gas tank is something that our bodies can rely on for an extended period of time simply because of its size and the fact that this tank is also quite efficient. We don't necessarily use the fuel in this tank at a very alarming rate. And if we're trained well enough, this tank can even be refilled as we use it. The oxidative system is probably the most common system used by any long distance runner, cross-country skiers, cyclists, any endurance athletes in general, but it's trained by all athletes. Athletes with an efficient oxidative system can save their other systems for harder work. So even the football player or the sprinter or the high intensity basketball player or speed skater who relies on oxidative system during a training environment can really kind of push their other systems into savings for an extended period of time and perform more efficiently. Athletes with well-trained oxidative systems show better endurance. So no matter who you are, even somebody that performs in high-intensity tasks more often, having a well-trained oxidative system is an extremely beneficial trait. Looking at glycolysis now, we have to understand that the glycolysis tank can rapidly deplete if we are working too hard. That is to say, we are relying on fast glycolysis instead of slow. We'll also be producing lactic acid as a byproduct, and we'll be delivering oxygen debt at a sooner or faster rate. The glycolysis, as we discussed, has its two forms. So lactic acid we talked about being a byproduct of fast glycolysis, not the cause of muscular fatigue. It is potentially a good thing for the athlete, especially if we can train our bodies to utilize it. Lastly, let's talk about the phosphagen system. The phosphagen system is relied upon for ultra-short, sudden bursts of power and high-speed movement. As a primary system, it can't last much longer than 6 seconds. So even in a well-trained athlete, somebody who's performing at the Olympic level, if their duration of a task lasts longer than 6 seconds, that athlete is not relying solely on the phosphagen system. In order to fully replenish, the system needs 3 to 4 minutes. So when we're talking about athletes who are trying to train in speed power capacities, we really want to start thinking about that interset rest. Somebody who really wants to train that phosphagen system and they're kind of performing rapid bursts or rapid successions of a movement, but they're only giving their bodies 30 seconds or 45 seconds of rest in between each of those movements, they might not be performing practice as deliberately as they think they are. And that's another great example of how people can get carried away with kind of this mentality that training should be hard, it should be exhausting, it should be fatiguing. Not always, and is actually rarely the case when training the phosphagen system. It is by far your smallest fuel tank in the examples that we've given, and it's also the most powerful and the most explosive. The principle of diminishing returns is something that we should also talk about with respect to energy systems. An athlete who's training at their highest capacity in any of the three systems should exhibit diminishing returns with respect to training results. So diminishing return basically refers to any time that we receive a lower output or a lower score or a reduced rate of recruitment in a subsequent attempt or bout of exercise. Diminishing returns can be a good thing in a training session because it lets us know that our body's getting tired and we're creating a training stimulus. So we kind of want that for a training adaptation. We want diminishing returns in order for us to come back stronger. But reverting back to that theory that I just kind of let you guys know about the phosphagen system, or training a system that requires good interset recovery, we shouldn't just expect a training session to be high quality if we're not giving ourselves enough rest between each set or each bout of intensity, and therefore we're not even training the right system to begin with. Lastly, let's talk about training adaptations. Our bodies adapt to aerobic and anaerobic stimuli differently. So when we train our aerobic or our oxidative system or slow glycolytic pathway, we really want to do that with respect to kind of focusing on the total volume and total fatigue. Muscular anaerobic endurance are basically what stands to improve from an aerobic adaptation. All right, so because high-speed movements are generally not involved in oxidative or aerobic trainings, the risk of injury in an untrained or beginner level athlete can be reduced here. And training the oxidative system is definitely a gateway to improving your efficiency all around. We talked about this once already, and just to provide one more example, let's think about football players. Football players are historically telling me all the time that they don't really need to train their oxidative system. They don't really need to train an aerobic capacity. They just need to focus on speed and power. One of the biggest reasons that's not true is because at any given time in football, the tempo of a game can really increase and it can really pick up. And players that are in between plays and so inefficient aerobically, they're unable to get their heart rates back down and unable to kind of bring themselves back down into a state of oxidative work. They're actually anaerobic, or they're using their fast glycolytic pathway even in between plays. And then when the next snap occurs, those players are already exhausted. They're not reset, they're not recharged, they're not able to kind of perform at an ideal performance state anywhere near it, in fact, when it comes to producing a powerful burst of energy, because they weren't able to kind of bring themselves back down to recovery mode in between those snaps. Anaerobic adaptations are things that occur as a result of high intensity interval training, when our bodies basically respond positively to an increased number of mitochondria in muscle fiber, to an increased amount of muscle fibers there, or muscle density in terms of the overall cross-sectional area of muscle. There's literally more muscle fibers there to work for us. That's an anaerobic adaptation. All right, so literally when muscle grows or muscle becomes more dense and stronger, that's an anaerobic adaptation. And so this does happen through aerobic processes as well. We see this more often in the anaerobic sense. So studies that reveal the best response show that athletes who train both systems, on both sides of all systems, aerobic and anaerobic, see the best results. So once again, even the marathon runner, the cross-country skier, the cyclist has a good reason to be in the weight room, lifting at high speeds, lifting at higher resistance loads every once in a while. And for the same reason, the sprinters and the football players and those high-speed power athletes, they should be going for a long run or a jog every once in a while. So nobody's really exempt from one type of energy system training. When we're thinking about speed power adaptations, one more thing worth saying is that there are really kind of two targets here. One is muscular recruitment. We want to increase the amount of activation at the cellular level. We want to increase the rate of force production as well. So those are kind of the two good benefits when we're training in a speed power environment, and that doesn't always reflect lifting something heavier or doing more of something. Don't confuse speed and power adaptations with higher resistance loads. When we're training speed and power, what we're trying to improve is the rate of force production, not necessarily the overall amount of force production. So properly training the phosphagen system really means paying enough attention to the amount of rest in between each set and the speed of movement during each repetition. So too many, too heavy, and too often can be the worst enemies of speed power adaptations that just aren't happening. And if you're not seeing results in your speed power training, this is definitely something to be working toward, making sure that you have the right amount of interset rest, that your loads are low enough, they're not too high, and that you have the right set rest protocol working for you. To end, let's talk about this. We want efficient systems. So going back to the idea of efficiency, we want oxidative systems to operate efficiently. We want good oxygen-rich blood delivery. That doesn't happen from focusing on just training one system. System efficiency is based on this kind of interdependence between all systems. When one system works efficiently, other systems can work more efficiently as well. So for the football player, stamina and muscular endurance can be desirable traits, especially in the off season. For the sprinter or speed power athlete, oxidative stresses, once again in the off season, can definitely be made a priority. We want to make sure that we're well-rounded athletes and that we're regularly training across all systems. We want to maintain fitness and improve on areas to kind of address our weak links, those areas that we kind of looking at right now saying, well, I'm fine with muscular endurance. I'd rank that as a 9 or a 10 out of 10, but my speed power, I'd probably put that around a 4. Just because you're not a speed power athlete doesn't mean you can ignore that weakness that you have. Athletes with great endurance and stamina that never leave their comfort zone, they're always going to lack speed and power, and the opposite is also true. Athletes who never really want to focus on that long run or improving that stamina, they're always going to lack that if they're only ever training in a speed power pathway. So appropriate energy system training, again, it's a huge part of deliberate practice, and hopefully by now you're starting to sense a pattern that a lot of what we talk about in this class is going to relate back to deliberate practice in its basic context. So thanks again for watching, and if you have any questions, you can always contact me, and you know where to find me.